Okay, Matt, ready to go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yes. Hello, everybody. So on behalf of Jim and myself, we wanted to welcome you to the 2020 SIGCOMM Education Workshop, the online networking education community discussion titled Teaching and Learning Computer Networking During the Pandemic and Beyond. Jim, if you could hit the next slide, that would be great. So we were thinking of kind of starting out, just kind of briefly reminding you about the purpose of the workshop and talk about some logistics. So the pandemic that happened recently was kind of a surprise. You know, it's amazing because it kind of resulted in this really big change in the way we teach. You know, there's this massive and rapid change to online teaching. You know, moving from face-to-face meetings to completely online meetings at pretty much almost everywhere, you know, colleges and universities and even K through 12 schools around the world. And there's almost no time for preparation. You know, moving a course online or learning to teach online is something that's really hard and something some people, you know, take years to do. And many of you had to do it within weeks, and that's just such an amazing accomplishment. And so there was amazing effort and creativity that happened in our community to make this happen, just to even finish up these ongoing courses. So there's been so much innovation and improvisation and, you know, learning by doing. So as we kind of look forward to fall, and, you know, even beyond that, there might be, you know, resources that we've developed or knowledge or lessons learned. We've tried a lot of things. Some things worked, some things didn't. And so we were thinking that if we could kind of have a coming together of minds in our community where we can kind of, you know, share our experiences and talk about some of the things we've learned, that might be something that could benefit our community. And so that's kind of the idea behind this workshop. So Jim, if you go to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so you know, there's been amazing participation as well. We received some really incredible papers. So we accepted 44 white papers, and these white papers are, you know, really amazing in terms of depth and in terms of what they cover. Very thoughtful, and they come from all over the world. So very amazing, you know, diverse participation. In terms of the kind of breakdown of topics, the papers kind of fall in these different categories. You know, there's some papers we noticed that kind of talk about experiences. So, you know, experiences people had teaching and how they did things and kind of the lessons that they learned. And these kind of fall into two categories. There's some papers that kind of talk about individual courses and some that kind of give a broader perspective of teaching in general. There's also some papers that talk about community resources. So resources that people have developed, you know, teaching tools and platforms. There's papers on pedagogy, so techniques and tips to make us more effective teachers. And then there's some papers that kind of talk about the bigger picture and looking forward. The workshop itself is also very diverse. We have 208 registrations from 35 countries. Jim, maybe you can show the map on the next slide. So this is something that you know, we find really incredible is the level of participation and diversity in terms of who's attending. And we think this is a really good sign for our community. It shows that all of you are, you know, people who really want to improve your teaching. And so that's something that we're gonna be working on here. So Jim, next slide.
Got the survey up?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of a little bit more about you, a lot of you filled out the survey that we sent out, and we asked some questions about you, and we found out that the people who are attending come from a lot of different backgrounds, and so we have a lot of different opinions, and that's another strength we're going to have here. You teach all sorts of networking classes, ranging from wireless to core networking to IoT. Many of you teach at different levels as well. There's people here attending who teach undergraduates and masters and PhD students and professional adults. 70% of you classified yourselves as teaching at research universities, and 30% at teaching universities. So there's, you know, a lot of diversity there as well. Okay, next slide.
Okay. So let me say a few words about what the program itself is going to look like. So as everybody knows, you know, in a workshop, usually we'd be here for an entire day. Zoom is pretty tiring, no offense to Zoom, but we thought there were several people who suggested that we break this over 2 days, so that's what we've done. Day one, which is where we are now, there's going to be 3 sessions. They're going to focus on experiences and lessons learned. You see the 2 sessions there, 2 morning sessions, PDT there, and then we're going to have a discussion on community resources. Now, as Matt mentioned, this is really global. We've got 208 participants, now 210 from 35 plus countries, and so it's a global 24-hour workshop, and not everybody can make it live, and so what we're doing here is being recorded, and there's going to be a watch party, including live discussion following the rebroadcast again later this evening to accommodate folks where right now happens to be the middle of the, you know, the early morning and late night hours for them. So this is our session on day one, and then on day two, we'll be gathering again for sort of 15 minutes just to sync up. Then we've got a session on pedagogy, tools and tips. And again, everything you're going to be seeing here in terms of the panelists and the discussion that goes on will be drawn from the white papers. And we're going to have lots of time for discussion. We'll talk about that in a second. So session 4 is on pedagogy, tools and tips. Then tomorrow morning at 9:30, we're going to do something called Birds of a Feather session. And this is sort of derived from how the IETF operates. And the idea here is that we will have breakout sessions depending on what individual interests are. And so we've got a couple of BOFs that have already been proposed. We'll talk about those later today. But as we're going along, if there's a session that you would like to lead, and it's just to say, hey, I'm interested in being part of a discussion and maybe being a leader or the convener of a discussion on topic X, email Matt and myself, and we'll schedule a BOF for you. So this is just an opportunity for people to sort of narrow down and talk about topics in even greater detail. And this will be sort of a wide open meeting with everybody's video and everybody's audio open for that. Because we have so many participants, well, we'll get to this on the next slide. We're running this a little bit more in sort of a webinar mode rather than a 210 people all interacting at the same time mode. Okay, at 10:45 tomorrow, we've got our final session looking at the bigger picture, and then in closing after that, and then again, to accommodate folks on the other side of the planet from us, another rebroadcast watch party, and then again, another live discussion. So that's what the agenda looks like. And again, you may have noticed that we're calling this discussion. And as Matt mentioned, the shift to teaching online has happened for many of us so quickly that we're still grappling with a lot of questions. We're figuring things out. So the way each session is going to be run, each of the 5 sessions, we've got about 25 minutes of presentations by the session co-chairs, by the panelists, who are generally folks who've submitted white papers that are germane, whose topic is germane to that session. And then for the final 35 minutes, we're going to open it up for discussions, and that's questions and comments. And those questions and comments are going to be posted via Slack. So we're using Zoom primarily as an audio video channel, and then we're going to be using Slack, as we'll see on the next slide, to generate topics for discussion. And as Matt mentioned also, because this is so global, because we have people coming from participants from all kinds of schools with all kinds of teaching histories, access to resources, we want this to be a very open discussion that takes a lot of different and diverse viewpoints and experiences and backgrounds into account here. So discussion coming from all these diverse viewpoints, experience, and backgrounds is really, really important. And really that's why we're getting together. I think I've been involved in, this is now the 4th of the SIGCOMM education workshops. The first 3, I think, had maybe 25, 30, maybe 40 people involved. There's some of the organizers from that online now too. And so this is actually much more global and probably much more diverse. So we're really looking forward to that. So just a couple words about logistics, Zoom and Slack. We're using Zoom as the main audio and video channel. It'll be used for breakouts. For text communication, we're asking everybody to try to do that via monitoring Slack channels, and that's open for everybody's discussion. If you're on the Zoom call, you've gotten the URL and password successfully. That earlier email came out, we sent that out yesterday. Also has information about how to join by Slack. So the session co-chairs and panelists will have audio, video, and be able to show slides like we're doing right now. Workshop participants on Zoom will be in view-only mode. And we're, again, asking for questions and comments and discussion to come via Slack. So Slack, again, will be used for these live questions. And they don't have to be questions. They could simply be comments or observations or notes that you want to make. And the reason that we wanted to use Slack, and I'll really give a shout out to Matt for this, is that we really wanted this to be a long-term, persistent, and continuing discussion. This workshop is a beginning. It's not an end. It should hopefully be great discussion, but hopefully these great discussions will lead to continuing discussions. And that's going to be happening via Slack. So again, we're encouraging everybody to use Slack as much as possible. We will be recording. We are recording the Zoom session now. We will not be recording the Birds of a Feather sessions, and we'll be posting them later on YouTube. So we wanted to give everybody a heads up on that. If you haven't used Slack before, this is just this is what the Slack channel will actually look like over here. You want to make sure you're on the SIGCOMM 2020 Workshop Education Slack channel. And again, in the email that was sent to you, there's information about how to do that. And maybe over on the right-hand side, you'll see that you can see who's on the Slack channel. You can click on people's names. You can message with them directly. You can also message to everybody. Down here on the bottom is a messaging area. So again, we're encouraging the use of Slack. So keep an eye on that. Basically, we're expecting people to sort of have Zoom on one part of the screen and Slack on the other part of the screen. Okay, and I think with that, we're all done with the introduction, and we wanted to say thanks to folks. So this is being sponsored. It's great that it's free. It's being sponsored by ACM SIGCOMM. We have AMSL, who's you see a couple folks from them over here, their names here, who've been helping with the Zoom. We had just a fabulous workshop organizing committee. Lots of people submitted these white papers. If you haven't had a chance to read the white papers, they're just phenomenal. We have session co-chairs and panelists, and then everybody here who's going to be contributing to this diverse discussion. So thanks to everybody all around. Matt and I are looking forward, as I'm sure all of you are, to a really great workshop. So anything you want to add, Matt, before we take maybe a 1 or 2 minute break to organize ourselves for the next session?
I don't think so. Just really excited to have everybody here. Looking forward to some great discussions.
Okay, great. So we're going to take a 1 or 2 minute break. For those of you who are on the first session, if you could go to the bottom of your Zoom and raise your hand, we're going to add you in as panelists, which will then allow you, oh, I see Prométhée, you already did that. Junaid, great. We're going to add you on so that you all who are panelists have video, audio, and screen sharing access. And we will be back in, oh, we're starting at 9:30. Did we give ourselves a 15-minute break here, Matt? I should know that.
Let's see, that's a good question.
It's a workshop, so we're allowed to sort of do things easygoing.
I have 8:15 on my.
Yeah. So there's a typo at the bottom there. We are going. Oh, that's for session 2. Sorry. Let me stop there. We'll be back in just a second live with the first session. Okay. And so with that, I'm sharing my screen. Okay, and we're going to add our attendees in. Sorry, we're going to add in our panelists. Okay. Junaid, you are now a panelist. Nick, you are now a panelist. Matt, you're a panelist. Let's see, I see Prométhée, Junaid, Matt. And let's see, we need, hold on just 1 second. And Kevin. Let's see if we can find Kevin Long here. Oh, I see Kevin. Okay. Kevin, you are a panelist. Matt, you're a panelist. So I think, let's see if we've got all of our panelists online here. We've got Matt, I see Kevin, I see Nick, Prométhée, and Junaid. So I think we're all set to hand over the session to our first session chairs, Nick Feamster and Matt. So why don't you folks take it away?
Okay, great. First, for this session, I think a lot of the sessions are going to kind of start with maybe kind of like an overview of the white papers in the session. You know, it's really hard to capture, you know, what's in some of these papers with just a really short overview. There's just so many interesting ideas and tools and tips in these papers. So we're sure you'll, you know, find them interesting. You should go read them and all that. We're going to give some kind of quick summaries though, just to give you a sense of some of what some of the papers are in these sessions. So the first paper is called Online Courses Aren't Better or Worse, They're Different. And so in this paper, the author describes his experiences with online teaching. So first he talks about how he teaches, you know, on-campus classes. Then he talks about his experiences teaching a MOOC, and then talks about how he applies what he learned during the MOOC process to flip his own classroom. Author describes a number of non-intuitive insights that he learned while teaching online. It talks about, you know, how you can train yourself as an online teacher, you know, how you organize an online class, how online students can be different in some ways than on-campus students. And he uses this to argue that online courses, you know, they're not really better or worse. It's better to think of them in terms of being different. And if we're aware of those differences, that can kind of help to be better teachers. The second paper is called Cost-Effective Do-It-Yourself OBS-Based Smart Hybrid Mode Classroom. And this is an interesting paper because it kind of takes this position that, you know, we need to move online. A lot of people have to move online. And this process would be easier if we had kind of low cost, easy ways to do this. And so this paper describes a platform for making a low cost smart classroom. And it's a do-it-yourself system. So it's something people can put together with a minimum of technical knowledge and cost. There's a bunch of requirements that it fulfills. It has, you know, the ability to kind of do smart boarding, pan, tilt, zoom sort of cameras, smart markers, interactive projectors. It kind of replaces those sorts of functionality, and it's built using commercial off-the-shelf components. And the paper kind of describes the details of how that's built. The third paper is called What Is Zoom Not Telling You? Lessons from an Online Course During COVID-19. So what this paper did is they did a pretty detailed study of how students interact with Zoom, how learning can take place on Zoom. So it did a user study of Zoom usage in a classroom. And they studied all sorts of things, the attentiveness of students, you know, how often they're absent, how often they're disconnected, how well all this stuff correlated with grades and understanding. And there's some pretty interesting data in this paper. For example, Zoom had this feature to kind of track eye movements and, you know, tell if you're paying attention. And so they did some statistical studies of that, which was quite interesting. The next paper is called On the Use of MT2 for Computer Networking Courses During the Pandemic and Beyond. And it describes this approach to teaching called MT2. And the idea behind MT2 is you organize your class with a lecture track, and then there's a set of parallel tracks that kind of hang off that lecture track. And the parallel tracks are designed to add more depth. So for example, track 1 might be kind of your core. It might be like lectures. And then track 2 might be, you know, writing up a research paper. Track 3 might be doing an implementation. And the idea is that if you kind of make things modular, but also parallel, then if students get stuck on any one track, they can kind of make progress on the other ones, if that kind of makes sense. So they can push on these different directions in parallel. The next paper is on exploiting virtualization for interactive virtual teaching. And this paper addresses a challenge that, you know, many of us face, which is kind of doing laboratory work online. A lot of our field is quite practical, and we work with real systems and, you know, deal with real data sets and things like that. And there's a question of how we move these things online without losing the realism of working with real systems. So what this paper did is they go through the process of constructing a container to containerize some of the laboratory infrastructure that they had. And then they observed how students adapted to using this new environment. There's a number of interesting observations. One of which is the students, they kind of did almost this crowdsourcing thing where students autonomously do things, like they create their own GitHub and their own syllabus for the class. So it's kind of neat how that was done. The next paper is Online Teaching of Project-Based Learning Courses, Issues, Challenges, and Outcomes. And it explores the use of project-based learning in an online networking course. So project-based learning is kind of the standard approach of you learn not just by going through a set of materials linearly, but you pick a particular complex question and you dive into that in detail, and from that you learn. And they explored the application of that to online networking. And this paper is quite detailed and rigorous in terms of describing how they did it, platforms they used, and the lessons that they learned. For example, they look at, you know, how general data protection regulation can affect what you put online, you know, asynchronous communications and things like that. The next paper is on teaching continuity of electrical and computer engineering courses under COVID-19 pandemic. What this paper did is they point out there's kind of these two modes of teaching. We can kind of divide online teaching into kind of these two modes, synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous is you're live and you're interacting with students. Asynchronous is you record your lectures or put things up online. And the paper points out we need both of these styles of interaction. They fill different functions. And they explore the trade-off between these two things. So when you design a course, when you design a networking course, what sort of materials do you have asynchronous? Which ones do you have synchronous? A lot of explorations in terms of what worked. They also describe what didn't work, which is also very interesting. A number of questions that were asked. For example, how can we engage students using their own local culture? Was a kind of an interesting question that was brought up. Next paper was on first year master's challenge in the Corona semester. So what this paper did is it studied the teaching of wireless networking to a group of students. And the instructors here had this issue where they had a group of students and they went overseas during the pandemic and they got stuck there. So they're kind of co-located, but they're located remotely from the instructors. So they describe a series of challenges and how they address them, and some interactions with the students. So some students, understandably got distracted, and there are issues with deadlines and things like that. So they talked about how they chopped up the course into finer grained deadlines. And there's some discussion at the end in terms of like how you avoid overwhelming students and making courses flexible for students and things like that, which was quite helpful. The next paper is on teaching an introductory networking course during the pandemic, lessons learned. This paper describes an instructor's efforts with taking her course and moving it online during the pandemic. And this paper gives this very detailed description of how she did that. So she talked about what software she used, what hardware she used, how she got all that to work together, how she produced lectures and course materials. It kind of walks you through how to do it. And the paper highlights the challenges, in particular, of doing exams, which is an interesting challenge for us to discuss. You know, how do you detect cheating? You know, and she had some insights in terms of how you use mock quizzes to troubleshoot examination approaches, which is quite helpful as well. The next paper is on teaching wired and wireless network security during COVID-19. And this paper describes the move of a project-based class online. So this is a class that includes some pretty hands-on stuff, like they're using Raspberry Pis and sensors and things like that. The author talks about how he did that. The author also produced a set of online networking modules for network security, and he's made that available for anyone to use. If you look at the paper, there's a set of links in there you can use to access the materials. The last paper in this session is called Networking Research with COVID-19. And this paper, enabling networking research by means of the network research itself. And so what this paper is about is it's this observation that a number of the challenges we're encountering are teaching challenges, but they could also be viewed as research challenges. And so this paper takes a position that, you know, if we kind of view these challenges as research challenges, we can use our expertise to solve them. And it goes through some specific challenges like real-time monitoring of human behaviors in learning environments and privacy considerations and visualization of human behaviors. And it points out that solving these challenges can benefit the social good, but it can also benefit the teaching process as well. So this is kind of just like a rough, quick overview of some of the papers in our session. And so what I think we're going to do next is we're going to have some of the panelists talk about some of the work they did in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to move to kind of a group discussion, so we can, you know, kind of all think of questions and things we want to talk about as the panelists are kind of talking a little bit. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And Junaid, I don't know if you want to go next.
Hey, Matt, just to get your attention, there's an important message in the chat window that you may want to respond to.
Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. Let's see. Oh, interesting. Let's see. Hey, Jim, if you could check the chat window, that'd be helpful. Or Mike, if you could as well.
Okay, Matt, why don't you and we can chat on a sidebar. We'll turn things over to Junaid, right?
Yes, that's a good idea. Yes.
You might want to mute your mic and turn off your video.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. I'm Junaid Qadir. I'm a professor at the Information Technology University, and we contributed 2 papers to this workshop. The first one is teaching continuity of electrical and computer engineering courses under COVID. This is work in collaboration with colleagues from University of Glasgow and UIUC China, in which they present an experience of transnational education. So besides this, we also have, so in the first paper, the authors are Azhar Iqbal, Imran Ansari, Sajjad Hussain, Juan Lai, Kamar, myself, and Professor Muhammad Ali Imran. In the second paper, this paper is focusing on the education in Pakistan during COVID. And this is in collaboration with Sayyid Muhammad Irtiza, myself, and Muhammad Kamran Nishad. So I will not be able to talk about all of the things and the experiences during this 5-minute discussion, but I'll focus on the Pakistani perspective. And if there are questions that require more discussion, I'll be happy to take those questions in the discussion. So I will start by sharing a few pictures which basically capture important aspects of Pakistani education system during COVID. So Pakistan is a developing country in which there are some parts of Pakistan which face problems related to internet connectivity. So this is an issue in many developing countries, but also really this is a global issue as well. When we talk of rural areas, So these are areas that have fewer people per unit area, and the conventional telecom services, they don't find it profitable to go to these places. So in many places in Pakistan, we have very poor internet connectivity, intermittent connectivity. So the left-hand side picture shows of a person going on a mountain top with a mobile phone and connecting to the internet through that. So this is a real scenario for many students, particularly those who are not from the major urban centers like Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, Rawalpindi. So we have certain areas in Balochistan, in the frontier province, and in the villages. So the rural areas have this problem. Secondly, we also had a big reaction to online learning. And this was because for many students, this is a totally foreign concept. They are very much accustomed to lectures. So we did see a big reaction, and this is even continuing to date, in which students actually protested on the streets as well. They ran campaigns on social media. So I got a picture. The middle one is one that is focusing on this. And the third is a viral video that basically captures students taking a test. So many universities, they decided to go for take-home exams. And the challenge therein is that students may collaborate unethically. So this was one of the earlier attempts from a university, and many people, they actually gathered together. So, and you know, this paper was supposed to be open book, but when you open it up, there is this problem of people possibly making use of unethical means, colluding with each other, and so on. So this is the backdrop. So in the paper, we describe these challenges in more details, but for these 5 minutes, I'm going to focus on the higher level issues. These high level issues have been talked about in our other paper, which is going to be in the next session, which focuses on Pakistan. So in that section, apart from describing our experiences, we also provide some guidelines for instructors as well as for students. And these are really summarizations of other papers that I've written that have been published this year. The first paper is summarized in a section in that paper. It's called The Triple Imperatives of Online Learning. And in this, I talk of 3 imperatives. The first imperative basically deals with, it's called the equity imperative. It can also be called the non-maleficence imperative, in which the idea is that in many parts of the world, you have a difference between the haves and the have-nots. And you have certain people who are backward economically and otherwise. And when you move to online learning, it is the disadvantaged class of people who face the bigger online penalty. So there's a lot of research which shows that online schooling is quite different from online learning. So typically when we think of online learning, we think of people making use of massive open online courses. But when you make a transition in which all of your public and private schooling and college and university systems are going online, it's a big shift. And a lot of research has shown that there is an online penalty. When you go online, the learning outcomes are not at the same level. So, and the people who are disadvantaged, they face a bigger challenge. In terms of Pakistan, this would be that the people who are in the rural areas, they're already somewhat backward in their academic achievements because of various reasons. And when we move to online learning, these are the same people who depend on institutional resources. They make use of the libraries, they make use of the public computers. When we put the impetus on them that they have to manage online learning themselves, then it is quite challenging for the disadvantaged folks. So we suggest that it is a duty of the educators to think about all classes and think about not widening inequalities. So we say that this imperative seeks to mitigate actions that intentionally or unintentionally widens inequality. More details are in the paper. The second imperative is the inclusion imperative, in which we recommend that the teachers should take all the stakeholders on board, primarily the students. And for example, depending on your class, it may mean that you may have to design your pedagogy and your dissemination mechanisms differently. And thirdly, this is the effectiveness imperative, in which if we are able to handle the first two imperatives, we also focus on doing as well or even better if possible than what we were doing in face-to-face learning. So in a way, these three imperatives are sometimes at conflict with each other. So herein comes the art of teaching. So you have to decide how to balance these things. And many people are recommending that if you have to prioritize, you should prioritize equity and inclusion before effectiveness, even if it means that your effectiveness drops for just this semester, let's say. For the next semester, we have more time to think about it. There is a phrase going around in the education circle saying that we must Maslow before Bloom. The idea is that these are two taxonomies which refer to human needs and also the learning outcomes. So even if we have to maybe go somewhat light on the effectiveness, it's important that we focus on the equity. The ideal thing is to focus on all of these things together. Also, this would dictate how you actually make use of the various options that are available. So we have moved from face-to-face learning totally to fully online distance learning. But this is a big problem because this is a big shift from what people have been experienced and accustomed to. So depending on the constitution of your class, we recommend that you take into account these three imperatives. And it may mean that you have a combination of synchronous and asynchronous mechanisms, and that you make use of classroom aids, coaching sessions, and so on. Which brings me to the last slide I want to talk about, which is in the same paper, we also talk about guidelines for students. And this is in fact a summary of a paper we've published in MDPI Education Sciences, which is titled A Student Primer on Thriving During and Beyond COVID-19, in which we make various recommendations. I will not be having sufficient time to cover all of these. The details are in the paper and in the original paper, which is published in MDPI Education Sciences. I will just highlight 2 or 3 points. Step 4 is that students should become more coachable. They should become more independent. They should learn self-assessment skills. They should learn how to take ownership of their learning. In a way, this adversity can be helpful for students because this can enable them to become better learners, but this will not happen automatically. And therefore, institutions must have mechanisms to support their students. So I think I've taken more than my 5 minutes. I will stop here, but I will be happy to discuss these things more in the question answer. Thank you.
That's really great. Prométhée, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I cannot see how to actually share the, I don't have any sharing options here. Are you sure you gave me the, how can I share my screen? I cannot see any button here in Zoom.
Interesting. Let's see. Oh yeah, you're not listed as a panelist actually, I think. Let me see if we can add you.
Do you want me to raise the hand or can you see me?
Oh, let me see.
And I cannot see put my video also, so
Why don't you raise your hand, Prométhée?
Come again?
Why don't you raise your hand?
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you well.
Can you raise your hand?
Please, I will raise my hand right now. Here it is.
Oh, there you are. Okay, I think you're a panelist now. Okay, can you share your screen now?
So let me, yes, now I can. All right, so let me share from the iPad. All right, so it's gonna be up in a minute. So here it is. All right, good, thank you. All right, so thank you first for having me. Ratan, who is also the co-author of this paper, is also on Slack, so he will be able to take a few of the questions. So what is this paper? So we started using Zoom pretty early, by the beginning of February. We were teaching somewhere in the world. I won't say it's France or China, just to keep the privacy of the data that I have. And we started pretty early with this tool. And I still gonna have this kind of outline here. I'm gonna give a very brief background on the pandemic, show you my teaching setup, which is pretty impressive. So the picture have been very viral on the social networks. Then go through some of the features that we were using, and mainly the attention tracker that we have with Zoom, and the recording analytics, such as I can show you the results finally. So first of all, so here is the peak of this. So as we may see at that time of the year, we had, so can you, yeah. So we can see that we had, oh wow, my computer is asking me so many things. So can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So we had up more than 90% of the world student population actually affected by school closures. And in April 1st, we had something like 194 countries which actually implemented mostly countrywide closures. But you can see on this map that we also have localized one, all right? And few unknowns. So by the time when we started, the numbers in February were like 0.1%, and only one country affected. Okay, so, and then of course by April, we got those numbers. So we started using Zoom. So mainly the setup that we had at that time was a laptop from home with a network connection, mainly internet box. To this, I also tried to use some different inputs to improve a little, using, for instance, a headphone for the mic, or using some other webcams. So I tried different experiments and light panels to improve the video. I was teaching during the night, so it was important that people could see me. As well, for the video output, is really helpful to have a second screen where actually you can project the slides, and having the Zoom Zoom application window on one other screen. And as well, as I'm using now, of course, using a tablet such as an iPad really help in order to project the slide and keep things clear on the screen. So this is basically what I'm using at this time. So the slides are shown here, and so that's the reason you see it changing. So that gives this kind of picture from my office. So as you may see, it's pretty busy on the desk. But mainly, yeah, it helps quite a lot if you can remove some of the embedded devices from the laptop and replace some of them. So regarding Zoom, so when we started teaching, so of course, things are pretty easy to manage. So a class meeting can be scheduled either one time or over periods, like every Mondays, every week. You can invite students, you can start and stop the meeting. To manage the students, you can do things that you may not be able to do in a classroom, meaning that you can mute them, you can ask them to show their video or to show the video. So this is things that you can do online that are not obviously always wanted, but this is a plus. You can also have breakout rooms, meaning that you can separate them, such as the class can do some teamwork and not bother each of the teams. You can put them in the waiting room if you want to answer to a question during office hours. The interesting thing that we also analyzed is what are the feedback and engagement features that are provided in Zoom. And basically, we have quite a lot, including some that are not really obvious in classroom settings. So we have a visual feedback through the video, so that's pretty simple, but as well through the use of icons and emojis. So that is also very interesting for the students to engage. We have verbal feedback, so they can speak, so they can raise their hand and you can give them the floor as they can ask questions. The chat option is pretty useful as well. So if they feel pressure They can PM private message some questions, and the click-based feedback, which is actually whenever you want to suggest some questions, so they can answer and you can present the results of those polling questions. What is interesting as well is like you have recordings, and Zoom offer cloud hosting. So the videos are pretty interesting because you can either have the video with the audio only, or even the transcripts. So it's pretty good to have notes for the classes, because Zoom can provide you with the transcripts and as well some analytics later regarding the number of views offline of the recordings. So we use those data, and we also have the reporting. So the reporting is pretty handy whenever you want to take attendance. So this is right available in the meeting reports. The attention score, which have disappeared, but hopefully we were lucky enough to have enough data and collect those data, and as well the poll results if you submit questions during the classes. So those are the main features that we used. So as I said, for the feedback and engagement, so depending if you're the host of the meeting or the participants, so there are things that you can do. So for the visual feedback, so there's the screen sharing and annotation, which are very handy. The reactions I already explained. So those reactions may be like raise hands, but there are multiple more options that make it easier without students interrupting you either by text message or through the use of audio. So that's pretty interesting. The verbal is obvious. This is something that you have in the classrooms. And as I said, the textual with the chat, the click-based for the polling questions. So what we were interested in is analyze the tracking option of Zoom. So that tracking option, if you didn't have any chance of using it, was an option where actually each of the participants were supposed to be active if the Zoom window on their computer was on the foreground. And what would happen if for 30 seconds, over 30 seconds, the window was in the background? So then you would have two things. First, an indicator in the panel list of the participants. So you have a panel where you list all the participants. And there will be a clock indicating that that person is away or she's not active, okay? And at the end of the meeting, since Zoom is providing with a report, you have also the percent of time that each participant were active according to Zoom, which mainly was the window in the foreground, okay? So ever since, of course, there were a backslash of Zoom and they have to remove it in April 1st. So that feature is not available. And even more surprising, they removed it for any report from the past, previous to that date, the scores were erased. So even if we try now to download them from Zoom, it's not available anymore. So it was a big thing back in April. So they had to remove it and basically to make it disappear completely. So it's pretty interesting. So hopefully we downloaded all the reports and we have the data. So what is exactly the course that we gave? It was a computer networking course. 80% of the students were in the same time zone, hopefully. So most of them could attend live. Some other students could only watch the recordings. Out of those classes, we have a roster of 16 students. Almost half were seniors, 37% were sophomores, and other were juniors. And the whole class is a 14-week class. It was 3 meetings per week. Each meeting was 75 minutes. And each meeting was of either a lecture, a tutorial, or a lab. So I was attending the labs and watching what they're doing. It was time limited, so they could ask questions, share the screen, such as they could do labs using, for instance, Wireshark. So I was attending. Mainly, you will see from the result that during the labs, there were not a lot of attention, given that the main window was a Wireshark window, for instance. So we gathered the scores for the 7 weeks. Since then, it disappeared. So it was into a total of 20 class meetings. So let me show you the results. So the first result that we try to show here is, so we took the final grade of the students and we stacked the average score, the attention score of the students, depending on the type of meeting. So we can see that in blue, we have the lecture. in yellow, the tutorials, and in red, the labs. So the labs have a very low score, given that mostly the window of Zoom was in the background, so that makes sense. Let me just address this student here. So interestingly, this student was using two computers, one to run Zoom, so Zoom was always in the foreground, and another computer to run the slides or the labs. So that's the reason he get a 100% score anytime he was attending the classes. We can see that there's a trend here. So it's not really obvious, so I cannot talk about a correlation, but the higher the score, the more attention you get somehow. The other thing that we draw here is per class meetings. So we have 20 meetings. So what we tend to see here, and here we have the score, the average score of the class. So we may see that over time, the student were getting more attention during the tutorials. And for the lecture, we have a slight decrease, okay? So you may see those trends here. So the attention goes down for the lecture, goes up a little for the tutorials. And in order to confirm what is going on here, what we did as well is we took the recordings. And for the recordings, we actually look at the number of views. And what is interesting is to see that the lectures get a lot of views. So I just recall that we have 16 students. And per lectures, we have up to 40 views, between something like 40 and 30, except for that point here, okay? This one. But most of the time we get between 40 and 30 views, meaning that the students check the recordings multiple times for each lectures. Regarding the tutorials, though they were actually recorded, and I was writing the answers and showing the method or the steps to take, they were not so popular. I mean, we only have 10 views in an average, okay? So that should indicate that actually, so as a conclusion, I would say that for the takeaway is flipped classes seem to be a little bit suitable here for distance learning, given that the online retention is very high for the tutorials. For the lecture, less, even though we get more views offline. So that will indicate that for a lecture to be posted and viewed asynchronously by the students, that would be better. For the tutorials, having some live session is somehow more suitable. So the tracking score, I mean, the attention tracking is not so relevant from the point of view of the final scores. Why? Because I think that the tool is not really accurate. I mean, just measuring how much time is the window in the foreground doesn't mean that the student is not taking notes in another software, running another application on their computer. If we want to make it a little bit more accurate, it should be a much more invasive, and we probably going to run into the same problems. But I would say that even if we do asynchronous teaching, we also need to have some tracking to know if the students are actually watching the material offline. So in any case, I think that still those kind of tracking tools may be useful. Either it's synchronous or asynchronous. And as a conclusion, and this is for tomorrow, so Zoom provides us with some features that may not that be easy actually to be transposed in a classroom setting. For instance, the recordings. So this is something that we need to set up by a camera, extra camera. Here we don't need to do that. The reporting, for instance. So whenever we post the recordings and we have the analytics. So this is something that we need to have a hosting platform. Not sure if there's something really available for the size of the videos that we have. And then for the feedback as well, they are pretty rich. So we have multiple tools here or feedback options that may not be that obvious in a classroom setting. So that's the takeaway on this paper. I keep more time for the discussions, but that's the main points of this paper. Thank you.
Okay, that's great.
Conclusion here.
Yeah.
So maybe in the fall 2020, we have students complaining that those classes should have been Zoomed and not be in a classroom setting, maybe. Anyway.
Yeah, sounds
All
good.
right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Kevin, do you want to go next? If you could stick to about 5 minutes, that would be great.
I think in order to do that, I probably should skip slides and just give a really quick review. You wanted me to go next, that's right?
Oh, yes, if you could, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. So my paper is really a little bit of a different tilt. I've had one foot in industry and academia for my whole career. I was senior technologist at AT&T and have taught at the University of Houston. And then for the last few years, with the break since the pandemic, basically at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. So I've had kind of one foot in academia and one in industry, and then another pair of feet, one in the US and one in Mexico. So what I tried to do in my review paper is bring you some perspectives from both of those angles. For the industry difference, I've been acclimated to what I would call, and did in the paper, sort of industry standard or industrial strength tools. It turned out that when I began to try and teach remotely, and I started to see more of Zoom and some of the other tools, that I realized that industry has had to tackle people spread over wider varieties of bandwidth and geographic locations and latencies and device types than maybe a teacher would normally expect to see among the students. Even if they leave and go home within a country, they may have more similar technologies available if they're all in the same city still, for example. So being able to deal with things like that, I gave a couple of detailed examples of how those tools deal specifically with audio latency. And one of the clever things that WebEx did that I've used a lot is they will pause transmitting audio if they're not getting enough from the speaker, and they'll gather it together. The packets will eventually hopefully arrive, and they will re-encode the audio at the server and send out a new audio stream that sounds like you're speaking faster. It's not sending more packets, but it's compensating for that delay by fast forwarding your talk. So it may sound like I'm suddenly starting to talk faster, and that catches things up. So there's lots of subtle industrial strength algorithms at play there that keep everybody in sync, and it aids in managing things forward. So we go through a variety of examples such as that, the ability to control and security and collaborate in real time and record and stream and upload. So that's one theme in the paper, is just walking through some of the standards. I've done so many commercial broadcasts, having worked for industry and being asked to do press conferences and testimony to the FCC and things like that, that I got sort of acclimated to some of the hardware upgrades and offer some examples and advice on what I found helped improve the quality more. One of the things that is often overlooked is the branding. And so I make the point in the paper that, you know, you're it. When students tune into an online class, the first thing they see is the first impression they're going to have. If you think about when they come to the university, universities like to give you lots of visual reminders of the quality that you're about to experience long before you set foot in the class. The large buildings, the big banners, the landscaping, the statues, the logos everywhere. There's lots of reminders as they walk across campus towards your class. But on Zoom or whatever tool we use, the first thing they see is you. So I've tried to encourage my colleagues to spend just a moment and make a formal slide with the department logo and the title of the lecture, and use it incessantly at the beginning of every class. It also helps when you upload to give students something they can see. So we walk through a little of that. The cultural side may be more of a learning experience for me. Students have always preferred streaming. That's for sure. It's the organizations that have always had the issue with it. Having taught after work in the evenings for many years, I had a lot of professional students, and they really loved the fact that they may not have to slog through rush hour traffic in the nation's 4th largest city in the US and the 2nd or 3rd largest in Mexico just to attend a class that they could watch from a Starbucks instead. And so that's been a source of growing enrollment, I think, for some of my classes, because I'm flexible. But what surprised me is, whereas the US institutions, at least U of H, was first willing to let me stream some classes while I was remote as well, from Mexico specifically, the Mexican university, which is a huge 25, 26 campus affair, was completely uncomfortable with that idea. So the degree of change when the pandemic hit was modest for one institution and a total change for the other. Students do have important cultural differences, and I was reminded or taught sort of the hard way to really pay attention to things that were happening. A good example is one I gave is, I've always had this impression, I guess, I hope it was correct, that students were super competitive, and it was sort of dog eat dog, and who can get the better grade than the other. And I assume that was the case for my students in Mexico. I believed it was true for my students in the US. But when I did have to give one lecture remotely and begrudgingly got permission to do so, I noticed only 1 or 2 students showed up. What I didn't realize until later was they had all assembled in class anyway. They knew that I wasn't there. I let them know, but they all got together in class, and one of the students hooked their laptop up to the projector, and they all participated sitting in the same chairs, even though I wasn't there. And that had a pretty profound impact on me, partly because it taught me that I was stereotyping them and had made a terrible error in believing that, you know, they didn't care or why they would wanted to work together. They explained to me they sort of lift each other up and need to work as a team. And I think the US has taught them to do that a bit, but nonetheless, that was an important cultural difference. So I spend a little bit of time talking about what some of those efforts are as well. So I hope you enjoy the paper. I hope you take it as something that is, you know, ultimately personal, and therefore you can discount any pieces of it that don't match up to what your experiences were. But hopefully it's a bit of a checklist of things to think about from someone who's taught remotely since he could for at least 10 years with tens of thousands of remote lectures. That's my 5 minutes, I hope.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we can open things up now to a community discussion. If anybody has questions for the panel, you can feel free to post on the Slack, and you know, we'll help you ask them. Nick, I'm not sure. I think there's some questions coming in. Did you want to maybe start asking the panel some questions?
Sure. Hi. I've been tracking the Slack a little bit while the talks have been going on, and trying to triage. So I thought maybe we could go to Mark first. Mark, you had a couple of comments, one on questions or comments on dealing with spotty connectivity, and then a second follow-up on privacy. Do you have a question that you might want to put to the group, or a comment?
Nick, I don't think all the attendees have audio access, so I think it'd probably be better for you to summarize that and for you to.
Okay, let me reflect that back to the group. Okay, so let's just cut to the privacy question with regards to some of the engagement tracking, et cetera. GDPR restrictions, et cetera, may forbid some of the kinds of tracking metrics. What do the panelists think about privacy in general and the trade-offs between some of these tools' ability to track engagement and the privacy of students?
Well, I can offer a comment. What I tell my students the first lecture of every semester, the trade-off for having a tool that makes it easy for them to participate remotely also invades their privacy by bringing the class into wherever they choose to be taking the course, typically at home. And that having worked in industry for 40 years, I've heard everything that life has to offer. at some point along the way. And I mean everything. So if they hear something that's funny or embarrassing, dog barking, someone using the restroom happens almost every year, just, you know, realize that it's life. And you can smile to yourself, but if you laugh, karma guarantees you're next. On my side, I would make sure that I would never use a tool without being totally confident I know how to instantly eject someone, how to mute the class, how to set up procedures to make sure only students that are authorized gain access to the class before it becomes a liability for me as well. So those are that's one angle on privacy that I would offer.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to chime in on privacy?
Yes, so I think I can add to the discussion from a Pakistani perspective, a regional perspective. So one problem that we faced was, you know, apart from sometimes problems with internet connectivity, which made, you know, having a video on a problem, it was also a problem because we document that in our paper, that many, it's also a cultural issues where females do not want to be on camera and they don't want to be, there are instances in which memes are created, photos of the teacher or the students are used in anti-social ways. So that makes it difficult for many people to actually accept this. And so we have been accepting in our own classes, if we did not force anyone to open their camera if they did not want. But this becomes a problem when you are doing assessment. So I had a picture in my slides. If we do not, you know, have some sort of proctoring, then it becomes a big problem unless you are doing an open book exam. And even then, open book typically means it's your own work. But people can collude, they can exchange messages, they can talk to each other. So this is one aspect of it. Another aspect is that, you know, all these attention tracking things are open to being gamed. So people will find ways to circumvent whatever tracking methodology you're using. So because of that, and also because it's sometimes an intrusion of privacy. So we have to balance both of these two things.
So I'm just gonna add a couple of things in my perspective. So we have classroom experience, in-class experience, we have online. And obviously online we are missing some of the features that we have in classroom, including, okay, we mute the mic. So basically we have no feedback, okay, no sounds from the classroom. If the student don't want to share their video, which is also a privacy issue here in France, we cannot force the students, even with a background. If they don't want to show the surrounding or they don't want to show the video, there's nothing I can do about it. So what I mean with the tracking, so tracking is, I think tracking is a little strong as a word. I mean, I'm not invading, I mean, in my conclusion, the takeaway, I was not saying that basically we need to track everything that they do on the computer, but having some kind of feedback from the system saying that, okay, so that student was lost or its connectivity was not good, right? So somehow I would like to know if some student who doesn't want to share the problems, I want to know if actually they could hear me well or if they could see me. So this kind of feedback, if it's not tracking, so that includes what I mean by having some kind of feedback system, which actually I can have an overall view of what happened in the classroom, right? Online. In the classroom, we're not blindfolded, so it means that we can see the things happening, we can listen to the things happening. So when you're in Zoom or any other tool, you lose those kind of basically a perception that you have of the students. And I guess having few information is always useful to know at the end of the lecture what went well or wrong. So connectivity, for instance, yeah, you may have a report indicating that the quality was really bad for some students.
Great. I think this ties in very well to something that I think we wanted to turn to next, which was All of this discussion is really engagement tracking, attention tracking, et cetera, related. And one of the questions that came up, I think, during one of the talks was that how does engagement tracking relate to, complement, oppose learning tracking? So how much of the objective is tracking engagement, as we've largely been talking about, versus tracking learning? And I think related to tracking learning, a question came up about exams and how people deal with those. So first part of the question, are we trying to track engagement? Are we trying to track learning? Both? How do those things interplay? And a minor footnote to that is, what about exams? Maybe not a minor footnote, but.
Well, I'm gonna just say a quick thing. I mean, I think both are related, right? I mean, learning depends on how much you engage in the class. So what I mean is, like, probably it's maybe already too late whenever they have an assignment and they fail the assignment because they didn't engage in the class. So what I mean by tracking the engagement is as well to keep the students or engage the students who fell a little on the side, just in order then to make sure that by the time that the first assignments arrive, the homeworks or whatever is not too late. Yes, of course, we can have like homeworks every week. We can track the learning, but at some point we need to solve the problem. And if the problem is engagement, it's good also to know how much they engage and how well or how to do them.
Great. And do any of the other panelists have thoughts on that? Thanks for me.
It's not exactly related to this, but following on from the last question, I think if we do not ask the students to turn on their video, then it's a big hindrance because you cannot make eye contact, you cannot get that feedback. But one thing that can be done is, you can have other ways of getting in contact with students. You may have separate sessions in which you also have that rapport with your students, you get that touch, because otherwise it becomes just a set of lectures with no human presence, no interaction. And another thing I wanted to just highlight is that, in the class, it's true that the instructor can see everybody, but once you put and use Zoom for, everyone has the cameras on, or for the exams as well, because we are currently in the process of having our exams. And we did try that we would ask everyone to put their cameras on, but that's different from the usual in-class operation, because every student is just focused on their paper. But now they can see everyone in the midst of attempting their paper, and many people make awkward faces and so on. So even for that reason, some people are not very comfortable with sharing their, their pictures while they're doing their exam. So there's a little bit of difference of in-class versus, on camera interaction.
Excellent, thanks. I think related to, just continuing on the theme of engagement a little bit briefly, there was a question from Vasanta about the use of active learning modules. I think her question was directed to the second speaker, but maybe we can just throw it to the panel. Her question was if active learning modules were used in tutorials versus the lectures, and whether that contributed to some of the differences in engagement. But I guess to turn the question to the whole panel, do people have thoughts or tips or other ideas concerning the use of active learning in this particular environment?
I would say that, yeah, it's always really good to have the students and giving the tools that we have where they actually can share the screens and they can basically participate by showing their work. it's really good. But once again, it's a scalability problem, right? It scales for a class of 20, 30. But as I can see from some of the comments on Slack, right, some had 100 students. So you need to have a breakout of the classroom and have multiple sessions in a week, giving that, yeah, or you can have also the TAs working and helping with this. So I'm pretty sure that doing this with the help of a co-host, which can be the TA, may help.
And I might add, Nick, if I could, that in tomorrow's session on teaching tools, tips, and techniques, there are a couple of papers, white papers in there that talk explicitly about active learning. There's a paper from Cal State Monterey. There's a paper from MIT. So I think this is something we'll come back to. It's a great question.
I'm also dropping a link to a paper from the ACM that was published, I think, last week by Zwei Galil on the Georgia Tech's approach to keeping students engaged in their Master of Computer Science program that's online. They had a faculty team that got together and looked at what the differences were between the in-person, and they saw some really significant changes in the way to engage students, how TAs played a role, how they organize students in other kinds of groups. It's short read, 10 minutes, and I just tossed it out there if anybody's interested.
Yeah, I was one of the first teacher. I was one of the first 4 teachers in that online masters. So we definitely struggled with all of these comments that are coming up with regards to engagement and assessment. So yeah, that's definitely a very good read. Let's see. So I think we only have a minute or two, maybe 90 seconds to go, I think Jim tells me. But there was a lot of excitement around the topic of recorded lectures. Plus, I guess pluses, may be evident, but there was a lot of questions about potential negatives. In particular, one was people feeling less likely to engage if their mistakes are being recorded. And the second is the misuse or misappropriation of recorded content. So what did the panelists think about these particular concerns with recorded videos? In particular, I think Mark Oliver mentioned the term error culture. Do we need a different error culture if everything is being recorded?
Well, the thing that bothers me is my materials constantly uploaded to sites that students pay to access. And that's gone on for years. And so at a state school, it's ultimately the Attorney General's job for the state of Texas to send letters out to ask these firms to cease and desist. Nothing has ever risen to that level yet, but the cumulative effect of it, especially if we're adding secondary education into it, which the state also funds, maybe there's an opportunity for that to change.
Junaid or Prométhée, I think we're 6 seconds over. So speak now, or Kevin will have the last word.
I totally agree with what Kevin said, but hopefully you have multiple options where you can remove the participant for the recordings, or you can ask the participant to ask the question by the chat. So you may separate things through multiple channels and have one channel recorded, so it may help.
Okay, so maybe with that, thank you all to all the white paper contributors and to our panelists and to the co-chairs for a really excellent session. Since we're talking about recording, I'll remind people that this is being recorded as we talked about at the very beginning, and we'll be posting this, and there's actually a live re-show this evening, and so there'll be other opportunities to contribute, and the Slack conversation will continue. Maybe lastly, I wrote a comment on this on the Slack channel. If there's a topic that came up here and people want to dive deeply into it, these birds of a feather sessions are just incredibly informal. They're not going to be taped. So in terms of error culture, Nick, there's going to be, you could say what you want, it's not going to be recorded. And it's just meant for open discussion. And so if you're interested in just helping to organize a birds of a feather discussion on a particular topic, email Matt and myself, and we'll schedule something. It's meant to be very, very informal and low key. No slides, no presentations, just a discussion, deeper discussion on a topic where everyone will have audio and video access. And so it'll be more like a conversation that way. So let me remind people, we're going to be restarting in 8 minutes with the second session. And let me put up what we're going to be doing there. Let's see. Okay, anyway, we'll be posting something in just a second. We're going to come back at 9:30 Pacific Daylight Time with our second session. And for those of you who are either panelists or co-chairs, we're going to be adding you, so your video and audio and slides will be appearing in the top like we just saw here. So we'll see everybody back online live in 8 minutes. Bye-bye.